Alyssa's a businesswoman, vice president of a company called MapZen. Before that was involved in a constellation, I think is the right word, of nonprofits called Open Plans that did very interesting work in Manhattan and also had one of the nicest offices I've ever been to. Before that, she was a student at the Media Lab, where she did a really phenomenal project called Hero Reports that had to do with kind of the civic fabric in New York after 9/11 and how people were being encouraged to inform on each other to the government. So she basically asked people to report acts of civic kindness in the subway system. Later, that project was expanded to Juarez, Mexico, which was then the murder capital of the world, and thousands of really positive reports came out. It was really kind of inspiring. And even before that, she did one of my favorite mapping projects ever that got a lot of international attention during the Iraq War, when numbers of civilian casualties were probably over 1 million, according to The Lancet, the medical journal The Lancet. The average Americans said that there were 9,000 some fatalities in Iraq. So somehow there was this big kind of gap between the number of civilians who had been killed and the number of civilians that Americans thought had been killed. So she basically did this system, which was a backpack that you plugged in overnight, and it was connected to the internet, and it would download reports of civilian casualties in Baghdad, and then map it over your community in the United States. And the next day you could put the backpack on, and if you happen to walk in your city, if you imagine like an overlay, like a transparency, in the same places where you would have walked in Baghdad, where there had been a civilian casualty, your backpack would explode with confetti, the names of people who had died, civilians in Iraq who had died in the last couple months. A really powerful piece, and everyone who saw it was really profoundly affected. So Alyssa brings a lot of these backgrounds together in her current work. But the reason we brought her, apart from that, is her work in kind of the free open software business community. So, 10, 15 years ago, it was very common when someone heard about free software or open source, oh, it's great, if you're Bernie Sanders and socialist, but you could never make money off of it. And of course, that was, at the time, false. People were showing that it was false every day. But to be honest, there weren't so many clear business models. There was a famous thing in Benkler's 2006 book about how when IBM created a free software, open source software division within their company, within a year it was more profitable than all of their patents, and IBM makes more patents than any other company in the world. So, it's important to recognize that these business initiatives have been in existence for a while, and they've been growing. But to start a startup or to enter a new area where free software wasn't normal required a lot of creativity. But as Alyssa's going to show, it's now a pretty normal practice. So thank you, Alyssa. Let's put our hands together.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Yes, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. Maybe the backpack kind of demonstrated, but I don't originally come from a business background. I don't have an MBA. I barely balance my checkbook, and so kind of what was the transition for me going into an open source company into the business aspects of that was hosting a lot of events. So I continue to host a number of events throughout New York City and actually internationally. And one of the things that I love to do, especially with a more intimate group like this, is to introduce ourselves. You may know each other, but I definitely don't know you. So I would love to go around the room and do this, what we call a 3-word intro. So just I'm Alyssa, I'm coming from New York, from this MapZen, as we said, and a couple of open source communities. And the 3 words to describe me would be open, geo, and visitor. So just a little bit of background about me and how I ended up here, and also how I ended up in this open source mapping world. It did start when I was a student of Chris's. In 2007, I went to my first and only artist residency in Madrid. And it really confused me. It was a digital artist residency, and we were in this amazing city, and everybody spent the days in front of their computer tapping away. And I was I mean, we're in this amazing city. Should we go outside? I don't really understand this. We should go see art, stuff like this. So I decided I was already kind of interested in maps as like storytelling tools. I didn't really know much about the technology or much else. But I was like, I want to go and like explore the city. And so I was introduced through that realm to OpenStreetMap, which is like predominantly the open source community that I'm a part of today. And I'll go into a little bit of what OpenStreetMap is. You might have heard of it, but definitely dynamics, once you're when in the community. Anyway, I think what's always interesting to me is, so that was almost 10 years ago, considering it's 2016 now, and the people that introduced me to OpenStreetMap, and whether that was like online or the people that were actually in Madrid, are still part of the community and continue to be leaders in the space. And so, talk about like why one would get involved in open source, but it's always like fascinating to me that like a lot of the leaders and the voices that kind of existed at the beginning of the project continue to be like leaders and thought leaders in the project ongoing. So Chris is to blame for this. A little bit of Madrid is to get blamed to this, and also like the experience of getting lost in the city and all that kind of like, he doesn't want to take credit. But what I did is kind of made, I went through all the metro stations and took pictures and kind of made that a map of the city using OpenStreetMap. These are all pictures from the different metro stations. It helped me understand and continue to explore like the map as a story. And also it was like a community of people. And this I didn't realize it at the time, but it continued to have like direct relevance to my understanding of like building technology in the open, because as much as it is about like the technical questions that one encounters, it's also about the relationships, in the community and the people there. So I called it art. It works. And I called it an excuse to like kind of get outside and explore the city. And again, talk more about like OpenStreetMap, but in my experience like in open source cultures, but especially with mapping open source, it's oftentimes it facilitates like being out in the community. It has like a very strong tradition of being engaged, and that might be specific to mapping, that might be specific to open. I've always combined the two, but being like having a sense of place, and your contribution, I think, kind of resonates in the open community in general. Anyway, this is a picture of work that I did in Nepal before the earthquake. Kind of returned to it, but a lot of the OpenStreetMap work in Nepal was really critical after the earthquake came for like logistics there, and so it's a demonstrative of how open source and the communities that like kind of evolve around open source can be a lot more responsive to previous needs, because they were expecting an earthquake for as much as you can with seismology, whatever, and also in response to like the kind of immediate crisis. So because, I've been a part of other open source communities. I kind of go in this tomorrow if you come, but it was kind of like by accident. Like I liked maps. Sounded cool that there was like an open community that had like a social mission, but I didn't really understand what that social mission was. But so I kind of fell into the open part, but as like I look at, probably there's about 6 open source communities that I've been a part of. OpenStreetMap has sort of maintained like throughout, and so I just wanted to go into a little bit of what OpenStreetMap is. I think it's relevant. This obviously isn't about mapping, but like the kind of like pretend. I hope that the like kind of like a little bit of in-depth like kind of work into OpenStreetMap can help to expose like there are very like complex dynamics that happen in open source community, and it's not just like the development of code, but also like then how it relates to a business world. And so I feel like OpenStreetMap might be like a word that you might have heard, like if you saw Maurizio's talk on Monday, he had an OpenStreetMap logo. There's kind of like some key like elevator pitches about OpenStreetMap. But once you're in like any community, it's a lot more complex. And so like, let's dive into what that means. So if you can see the picture behind you, that is a kind of a visualization of changes of OpenStreetMap. I mean, you can kind of get a sense of like, oh, I forget where this was, I think like somewhere in England, but this kind of shows like a timeline of OpenStreetMap at the time. So one of the things that, like when we give presentations about OpenStreetMap, one of the things we always sort of emphasize is that, you know, it's as much about like a technology questions as it is about like the people behind it and the community and what the community has built and how they want to be kind of, you know, what their work is going to move forward. And this actually, in terms of business, just gets like quite complicated because, you know, a person going around their bike, you know, collecting GPS traces, which is like, you know, essentially just, you know, going on the bike ride and putting your phone on, may not necessarily be like interested in supporting like, you know, Apple's, you know, routing decisions, but and might actually have like, you know, philosophically like very different things from what is going on with these larger businesses. So when there's a lot of not confusion, but like tension that exists between like these sort of ideals of the beginning of an open source community and like where it might move with the inclusion of like business entities. So people, this is one of the conferences that we had a couple years ago in Portland. And you can see like in terms of the number of people, this is an older graph, but you know, you can still, like it indicates like it started about 11 years ago, I think in 2005. And then, you know, in 2013, there were like over 1 million like registered users. Like that doesn't necessarily mean like they're going into their house, you know, house contributing every day, but like people are, it is a large community and I think it has potential, I mean, to really like kind of change the way, yes, please.
How many users are there, do you know?
These are registered users.
But
like how many
registered to actually look at a map, right?
I mean, you can look at a map and not register.
Yeah.
So
do you have any idea how many like views and uniques you're getting, or
how many what?
Uniques, unique visitors.
That I mean, oh, to see a map.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many different versions of a map, and that's kind of what we I'll go into is like because the map is actually used everywhere. I think it would be like at first you'd have to like collect all of the examples of the map in service and then do those like measurements. So in terms of like who goes to the OpenStreetMap website, that's probably, we probably could get that number, but then, you know, you would, I think, multiply it by 1,000. So for instance, one of the businesses that like I refer to is like Foursquare or Twitter or even to a certain degree like Apple, back to Apple, like they use OpenStreetMap to some of their like, you know, mapping data set. And so, you know, measuring the amount of people that are going onto an Apple like driving directions is at least, I mean, difficult to us. Anyway, so since we're talking to so many people, you know, and this is obviously like a technology, like when you talk about business, I think, and especially for me, we're definitely talking about a technology and how it can solve problems, but I think what's sort of different between, or at least I've only been really in an open source like business model, but like what's always very present to me is that while we might be talking about better products or the experience of coding or, you know, looking at engineering problems, we're always talking about like the people that are involved, both the people that are the makers and the users. And so this might exist in more like traditional, you know, technical approaches, but it's definitely something that is very like a daily reminder. So people are important. There are many problems with diversity in any of these open source communities. Again, I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but like one of the numbers from earlier in the 2000s is like 1% of active people in open source are women. This is obviously not a real, I mean, it's not like real life in terms of like if you look around the room, there are a lot more than 1% of women that are here. So While OpenStreetMap, I think, has like the potential, or a mapping open project has the potential to like bridge boundaries and like think about different places. And like, I was mapping from Nepal while I was sitting in New York City. So like you kind of get connected to things. So I think it does have like this bridge like open source, and this the sort of decentralized structure of open source does allow for, I think, the potential for really strong connections. It continues to be really challenged with bringing in different voices. And so what's really interesting about some of the OpenStreetMap work is in terms of humanitarian efforts and in response to crisis, like I showed you the Nepal work. And so with that, people from many different kinds of backgrounds and many different colors and many different like privilege are working in this like open community, and not because they really care. I mean, they care about a map, and but I think more importantly, they care about what a map can do. So many different faces. This is a physical collection of OpenStreetMap data. You can see kind of the range of what this looks like when you're involved in a mapping party. And again, back to the point that many of the people have been involved for over 10 years. I got introduced in 2007, and now I continue to be some kind of voice. These are bizarre, not bizarre, but people are very, I think, committed to the work and the mission of the open communities that they're part of. So 4 years. Where are we? A little bit about the data. It's often called the Wikipedia of maps, and you might have seen this if you went to Maurizio's talk on Monday, but that's the logo of OpenStreetMap, that's the logo of Wikipedia, and then the combination of the two creates sort of this foundation for a bunch of different kinds of technical innovation. So for instance, and I go into this a tiny bit, but Maurizio gave an example of one of his demonstrations in the field, and it was a trip planner, and you can't do that without a sense of space. And I think there's a certain amount of assumption that space is something that's shared, but it's actually owned by just a couple of people, and so or a couple of entities, a couple of businesses. And so again, when talking about business and talking about the commons, again, it's an interesting space to look at. And it was very much in response to the origination of OpenStreetMap, and I think many of these open communities is in response to the decisions that businesses have made, and the decisions to businesses to withhold, whether it's a code or, for example, this is the data from a commons interpretation, and then what you'll see in a little bit and the innovation that's possible when you have access to this work. And that is, for my, or I'm just sort of brainstorming in a way, but that access, that control, that level of innovation is, I think, why you're seeing more and more businesses get involved in open source, is because you have a lot more, the level of creativity is a lot more interesting when you're not fighting over who owns the code, or for instance, who owns the fundamental data of space in this example. Another thing that I think is really important and kind of speaks to me actually quite personally is that you're talking about raw data, which is slightly different than open source, but it has a lot of the same ethos of philosophy of the people that are involved, but it's not as advanced when it comes to both the business conversations as well as the legal conversations. And so I think in many respects, OpenStreetMap stands as the cutting edge for what data means, or open data means. And so the first step, I think, for really a project like OpenStreetMap being in the business world in kind of with ease is to look at the licensing and to the legal questions. And so I think there are some open source communities that have figured out how to relate law to business models, but many of them kind of struggle in this space because I think the originations of many open source projects was not necessarily thinking of that progression, and sometimes we're in quite to tension of where a business might want to end up going with the code or with the data. So anyway. Lots of data, 200 million. So you have like this is a lot of people, a lot of data, a lot of stuff. And why would you be using this? We talked a little bit about Humanitarian. I mean, this is a really big like motivating driver for I think open source communities in general, but specifically OpenStreetMap. And this is from Michelle, specifically like the Ebola crisis, the logistics around that from the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders really rested on this open crowdsourced community. And so you see HOT was there, this is Missing Maps, which is a Red Cross initiative. You're seeing governments use open source. There was a number of like different memos like put across the US, and including everything from the military to like your transit system about these like ethos of transparency, but also of using open. And I think simultaneously it's motivated by this belief that it's cheaper, and that's not necessarily the case, but I think also a political statement of that openness means transparency and then means like working with citizens. And so there's like a circle of accountability that government is responding to. And here's an example, like we work a lot in like a 3D model, and I just want to point out like this is not possible with Google Maps. Do you know what I'm saying? Like you don't have that kind of control. This is like, or artistry, this is what's possible like with open source, down to the code, down to the data. And so you end up creating, I think, really fascinating things. So this is open data. It's all based on open source. It's like from the company that I work with. It's much more like 3D immersive, and I think, kind of speaks to a future generation. And this was only possible because New York City opened up their data set. So we were able to do like elevation of the buildings because this is a public data set that was then, kind of brought into the OpenStreetMap model. Academics, I mean, and I don't know exactly what technologies you're using, but academics, and I think the pursuit of knowledge and open are really intertwined. And so you're seeing, and then there's also I think a general movement to trying to educate more about mapping. Where's my phone? But that's a map in my back pocket. I have my computer's a map. My other phone that I have is a map. We're constantly carrying a map around us. And there's a general understanding, I think, or acknowledgement that we don't really understand what mapping is. And I think that can sort of extend to all technology. We kind of just accept that the experts would deal with it, and it's kind of in this niche field. And so I think we're seeing more in academia kind of inclusion of technologies into a general approach. And so when it comes to mapping, there's this thing of geo badges, which is kind of the Girl Scouts, etc. And then there's business. And so here is a collage of people that are using OpenStreetMap. This is just one angle for, again, using an open source project. But if we just take a moment of the number of significant names that are on that, in this collage. You have everything from Apple to Twitter to the White House in the US. There's a slide for this, but I think that I get the impression, I just didn't know what open source was when I was in building technology, but I think once you take a moment to look at it, it's actually fundamental to the entire internet, and is often kind of absorbed into a general philosophy. So when I talk about the business of open source, it's very multifaceted because there's there are some people like ourselves that are 100% committed to open source and open data, and there's no wiggle room around that. And then you look at Google, which is also has kind of strands of open source and open data in their mix, but they are not an open source company. And so how you make business with open source is really how you make business as a company, or one can consider, because it's so much a part of our technological inquiries. So me, somehow I got more involved in OpenStreetMap. I do think it's fascinating for the storytelling aspects, as well as the power that maps have. And so I'm currently, for my second year, president of OpenStreetMap US. This is the largest kind of national chapter. We put on a really cool conference last year at the UN, which was about 1,000 people, way more than $1,000. And I'm part of like some international working groups. The way like OpenStreetMap works, and not necessarily like all open source communities, like the kind of governance of open source communities can really like vary, where sometimes it's really centralized, like, or at least there's like a central curator, and then other times it's so decentralized that you wonder like where you should, who you should talk to. This is a very decentralized organization, OpenStreetMap, and so its management or its movement is really like done through working groups. So there's a handful of working groups, including the legal one that I'm a part of. And again, I think legal is sort of like the first step to really having this kind of open data set involved in the business world. And then, as Chris mentioned, I currently work at MapZen. This is my second open source, open data mapping company. Like when I tell my mom, like, hey, what do you do? And you're like, oh, I do open mapping. They're like, I don't understand. Like, why did you change jobs? Like, so it sounds the same. It's actually quite a different like company, if only because the culture is different. And this is a little bit, I'll go, again, if I have time, I'll go into this. Oh, actually, it's my next slide. So the goal, we're open source, open data, 100%. And we refer to this as an open strategy. This means that oftentimes, like, what we create is not like at the level of expectation that you would see in like more a proprietary software set. But our goal is to like, if we kind of expose what works and what doesn't, like with an open source and open data like approach, that it will inspire people to work together and improve it, rather than what we consider shortcuts of like kind of doing these like hybrid. And most companies do a hybrid, and they might have like 70% of their work is open and 30% is closed, or like what I was saying with Google, like 90% is open, and there's like, some interns that are working on, 90% is closed and some interns are doing some open source, but, so it's like the mix can look very different, but it's sort of interesting to just simplify and just be like, we're 100% open. The picture in the back is, again, all coming from like open data, and like is work that we did using this kind of like, kind of painting feel. And we often talk about our strategy as like commoditizing mapping, which again I think is like sort of resonates with other open source projects, is that this is not something that necessarily needs to be owned. Like space doesn't need to, like there's no reason that space is owned, but rather if we kind of all share it, we all create it together, it actually allows for the place for competition, the place for innovation to like move to a higher level. So is part of like where the hypothesis that we're working from. So if you look at time, it's not like there's a bunch of people that are fighting over time, but there are people that are fighting over like where this building is, and people own it, and people spend like millions of dollars, I don't know what the euros, to be able to access that at scale. And so again, this is just a mapping like example, but this happens like at so many different levels of sort of like open access. So this is all to kind of frame it as like, I talk about OpenStreetMap here, but there are lots of different like open source, even mapping software stacks, as well as like open data stacks that we're a part of. Like it's not, there's no one piece of this that's going to solve like every problem of having like an open like collaborative like space, but rather I think all these pieces, all these communities sort of working together to understand like what a more shared future could look like, and like an example of like where like what open source, open data could look like. This is an example, again, using New York City because it has like this open data set that was really rich in the OpenStreetMap community, and it has a cool skyline. But instead of having like traditional cartographers, or I guess in another field, like traditional programmers like involved in these like communities, you instead have, I come from what could be considered like an art background, this is an example of somebody who was like a game designer. Like you have like more different kinds of accesses, I think, into these communities because they're not as formalized or even like looking at a strict resume. And so while it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to diversity in terms of the representation of other voices, especially in like decision making. You do see a lot of diversity within, the white male field. So there are many companies that are working in this space. I'll kind of go through some of them as well as like a bit more tomorrow, but like there are at least thousands. And this is all to the point that like the internet really runs on this. Like it's, I think, an invisible kind of contribution. And in terms of mapping, I get the impression that we don't necessarily always recognize like how important mapping is for like the basis of all innovation. But that's my bias. So a really quick history, since I seem to be talking a lot about stuff about where business software and this like idea of mapping was, and how it's moving with the addition of like open source and open strategies into the business space from my observation. I haven't researched this. So business, I liken it a lot to like I used to like be in sports, like feels the same, you like compete, they're like winners and losers. It's kind of like, the capitalistic marketplace. I found as I was doing research for this, like this term like artificial scarcity, I feel like that really like sums it up to me. It's like, you work from like scarcity is there's only one winner and a lot of losers, and that's like what business looked like. This is an example of like every business pitch that you'll ever see, or there's usually even like a more extreme like hockey stick, but like, you start over there, you get more money, and you end up being successful, and that is like a prerequisite to like any like business discussion. Then software, I think, had like very similar like philosophies. Like you did it behind closed doors. It was very centralized. And whoever owns the code, or if you talk about open data, like whoever owns the data is the one who has like the market advantage. And what I have found, like working with people that are moving from like closed source to like open processes, like in this business sense, is that they're really tired. Like it's really hard to be working by yourself, like in these silos, not like knowing that like the person down the street is like doing the same thing, but you actually can't talk to them about it. So not only does like, there's a lot of weakness in like what you actually produce because you don't have like that dialogue of like critical exchange, but like it's after a while, I think people have gotten really tired of working on their own or in like their own team. And so I think about this a lot. It was that there's like visceral relief when you talk about, oh, let's do open, like we can all collaborate on stuff, and they're like, what? It's like very shocking if you've like come from a more protected like point of view. And so this is an example of like in the mapping field, like the leaders in the space. Like this is a $1 billion company. There we go. Really big fan of transitions. But this is a $1 billion company, and this is a pretty boring like interface. If you compare it to like the video that I showed you, one could say it's like showing this like similar data, and this looks like Microsoft Word, and yet this is like considered a successful company. What's interesting here is that there's this thing called open washing. I don't know if that's but it's like these companies that are very closed source, Google again might be considered one of them, is that it's really hip now to have like something open in like your portfolio, and so this company is also committed to open, according to their website, and so what that actually looks like, or what that like how that like kind of works with the community, is a complicated relationship, especially when they're making stuff like this. And then in maps, again, you might think that this building is like a shared space. We're all in it. Like we all know where it is and like where it ends and where it begins. But it's actually just owned by like 4 different companies, and they might have like a different like polygon to like represent that. And so if you think of any, whether you're an academic or a government or a larger company, you're spending like a significant amount of money either with like resources or to create your own like map data, or a significant amount of money to make a map. And as I was saying before with the phone, like everything is location based. Like if you're making anything that's like kind of a modern like era, it has to work on the phone. So it has to have like a sense of location. So this idea of like maps as creative works and that you can like own them like really gets complicated when I think thinking about like the future of one business. And to give an example is Google. Maybe this will make interactive. How many people do you think work on Google Maps? Since there's only so much I can. Anyone? Chris?
40.
Right, wrong. So, anyone else?
A couple hundred.
16, you said? Okay, so you're closer. It is an over a 10-year project, and like over 7,000 people work on it. So, and those are not the people that are just driving the cars. You have a lot of manual like effort to like make what would be considered like one of the most like robust data sets. And this is like an investment that Google made. With no like direct like return on investment, like they had to invest like a significant amount of years and people power in order for it to become like a clear return on investment. So the ability for a startup to do that, or small entity, like this is there are very few companies in the world that are able to invest that amount of money. If you pay attention to what Uber is doing right now, it's clear that they are uncomfortable, I think, with the future of Uber being like tethered to Google mapping, and so they have made a very clear investment into mapping and their self-driving cars, et cetera, and this is they're able to do that because they have like a significant investment. So there's a real pressure to change, I think, from these like more traditional ideas of like software and business and mapping. There we go. And this is when I just talked a little bit about like my own sort of philosophy. I talked a little bit about how people were tired. I'm sure there are like lots of really fascinating theories about like how, I don't know, the production of software, or like, and I feel like there's an academic space for this. But my philosophy is that like people were tired, that it was a really hard and lonely and experience to be working like in this like capitalistic business model, to be creating software in this like very like isolated space, to not be able to be responsive or agile, to not be like, to know you're working on like the same thing of like the guy down the street, and usually a guy, and or down like the hall, and so this kind of like isolation, I think, like really started to hit like a breaking point, and was a spiral. So that is a lonely person. He comes back later, but we feel sorry for them. So there is an increased tension, I think, for change that started to like evolve, and I don't know, I spend most of my day, this is what business looks like, it's on the phone. Like I spend most of my day on the phone. I show you a picture of my calendar, it's pretty sad. I always find it really fascinating when, again, the introduction of open source, or like they start like kind of like, brainstorming about what like open and cooperative like, mechanism could look like, that again, you feel like this relief, like this is like, a transition that is really tangible. And I think is one of the reasons why I feel like I'm doing meaningful work, is because, you facilitate that kind of like, day-to-day transition. So there was effort to change the rules. So I think there's like a general philosophy that if people stop being tired and they're happy, they create better products and they create better time. But I think what's important too is that it's not just about like the maker process. I just like we talk about how it's so much better for an open source person to be able to talk to their colleagues, stuff like this. But I think also there's like a simultaneous like influence of like you create better products for the users as well. And so, you might consider that like the entire community, but as more of a user than a maker at this point, like in my career, I feel like those are equally important. So these like ethos of creativity, flexibility, potentially a lower price, control, you can see participation and responsiveness, like all this stuff that I kind of showed you with that video, like that's both on like the maker side and the user side. So we started changing the rules of the marketplace. So instead of like this artificial scarcity, like something that I think about a lot, especially as I like, again, get on these phone calls or like operate my day, is to think of like how I do this work from abundance, how I actually like live my life from abundance, and or one could. And I think it's, I mean, it's actually, it's sort of a, I mean, a hard thing. I think we like kind of taught like to like work in scarcity, or you never have enough money, you never, like your house is never big enough, whatever it is, like it's never enough. And instead to sort of approach your work and and one's life, because they feed into each other, from like a place that like there's more than enough, and that you can create more. And so I operate, when I do like this business like with open source, which I think is in conflict, or again in tension to like a traditional like way of doing business, is that like we all like rising tide lifts all boats, like we all can be successful, and that I used this like term before, like create a bigger pot of honey. Like there's not just one piece of like one honey pot that like gets like passed around, but actually everybody can be successful. And so when thinking about that, like then you can see that competitors can work together on certain like open source projects, open data projects, because even though they might be competing, there's still some like fundamental core values that they share, and that's pretty present. So another cheesy statement, like again, I don't know if everybody approaches like business from like a feeling of love, but like I try to really remember like to be generous like in my approaches of business, because if we are successful, others will be successful, and vice versa. So this is and just in terms of business, like this is like kind of reference to this like sharing economics. So again, instead of like one person wins, we can all win. And so Airbnb is often cited as an example of the sharing economics. I think that's complicated, and so we won't go into there. But you can see here is like this is the conference that we put on, and so you'll see if you knew this space, there are many different like competitors like that are listed here, but all of them, I think actually conferences are a really interesting example to look at like how the business is operating, because these are companies that are putting in like $30,000 to help like put a conference together, and clear competitors and clear different offerings, but fundamentally they believe in like this. Here you have like an open source project. They are building its foundation, and so they put money towards that. And you can see like there are some like kind of significant like kind of mix of companies there.
But also the World Bank and Life Foundation and these other foundations, which is I think pretty unusual for a business conference.
Yeah, and Madeira is like another example. Like, I mean, you do have, I think especially with like the humanitarian like aspect, and also like this commitment to open from like governments and like NGOs, you see like a really like interesting mix of like organizations, including like the academic organization, and the individual developer. So when we say open strategy, we often also mean like open access, and that's like open as in many different kinds of like entities should have access to like this core software and this core data. Changing the rule of software, I kind of talked about this before. I mean, I don't think I'm doing something. I mean, I guess we're not all changing the world, but I mean, there is something that you feel like you're in a momentum and a transitionary like place doing open source, and nothing is perfect, and it's definitely not like one single model, and there's a lot of problems. So especially in my previous company, we ended up more as a military contractor. That's not what I went to school for, but you do feel like something is changing, and it's much more fulfilling to be in a model of whether we like make a ton of money or we don't. Actually, it doesn't. It matters like day to day. It matters. It doesn't matter as much as like being a part of something that feels like it's changing the rules. So where before you were actually purchasing the right, and there's a lot of weight on that, the right to use the software. This is when we think about changing the rules of software. This is more about like having this more open like space for source code. So. Let's see. Wrong one. Oh. Yeah, so ideas are not these scarce things, like again, that artificial scarcity, but rather that they can be shared, and that, you know, source code is ideas, and like as much, kind of fundamental data can be ideas, and that they're much better when you have like this conversation around it. And then, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong one. And then to the point that I was saying before, this is not just about like the value of like open ideas for the people who are making the software, and I think business, and I would say the inclusion of like HCI or like other kinds of like expertise into these like open communities, like is really bringing to the forefront. Like this is not just like the developer in the basement, like, and the value of that, like, you know, kind of contribution, but rather thinking about, that there are a lot of other like pieces of software, and a lot of value to having like again the kind of ethos of open. So again, we're not alone. There's not just like one winner and one loser. We can all be winners. Kind of a weird way to do business. Somebody will ask me at work like, oh, who are competitors? And I'm like, we have no competitors. We're just like, you know, all potential partners. And like trying to make decisions like from that point of view. I'm not alone in that, but it's actually something that you have to remind yourself to do. So we really talk in like internally, and I think in all of the communities that I've been in, of like changing the ecosystem. We don't know really where it's going to go, like what but that we know that there are things that like have not been working with the way it's been, and that we try some things out. What?
Are those Donald Trump minions?
Oh, I have no idea. I use this figure a lot. So yeah, there's another one. So that's business from abundance. And that this idea of trust, acceptance, teamwork, which is common to like the production of software and data, also carries into the business. Like they both like feed into each other. And this is a model that we consider sustainable. So instead of having like, you know, what happens if Google like bellies up? I mean, so much would like fall apart because so much is like relies on it. And so we can talk about open, but I think more fundamentally, and in the conversations that we have at work, we talk about sustainability. And so that these things, again, these code, this data, can exist whether we're doing great or not, and because there are multiple like entities that are invested into its future, so that we don't control the space, but rather like we're actors, like. And actors as an organization, and actors like, you know, with individuals. So there's a really, I think, powerful blog post that we put together, kind of talking about this philosophy, and I guess I'll just read the pink highlight. Essentially saying like, don't take shortcuts. I mean, I think the pressure, I forget if it's now or, but like, there's a lot of money that's going into open source companies. Elasticsearch is an open source company that we use, and they have $104 million of investment, and they're an 18-month company. Like, these are like huge, you know, paychecks that are going in, and that's like one of, and that's a success story in some respects, but like it's one of like many kinds of investment. I think that is also reflective of like, you know, where the business is now, and I think there are a lot of pressures that happen when you get that kind of like investment in the business world, and so oftentimes people that are committed to open somehow, like, you know, it gets a little murky. You know, that's not like, you know, there's a lot of things that aren't like 100% like, you know, perfect about open, and so there are these, you know, shortcuts or compromises that you make. And we're lucky to at least be in a place right now where we're really advocating for don't take shortcuts, but instead really be like committed to an open philosophy. So here's the Elasticsearch example. This is like a search code base based on Lucene, and there's like a lot of creativity. And this is creativity that I think is, you know, I want to say this is almost like 10 years old, if you've seen them, but like, again, this is open data, looks very different from Google Maps. This company and this cartography was really influential for my own like interest in getting into mapping, because I feel like our relationship to the world, like really, like if it's only a like one system or one, aesthetic, that we only really get one story. And so this is an example of like, open source like cartography that's been like in use and being used by people for, I'm gonna say like, somewhere around 10 years. And it's called a watercolor. I forget what this is called, but you can kind of see the range. And then with maps, again, obviously I like maps, they're everywhere. Maurizio was talking about it. We continue to do a lot. Sorry, I'm running out of time. And essentially, like, kind of the premise, I think, of any company that's doing anything around like mapping is that like we don't own a place, but rather like collectively and collaboratively, like we can do something to have it like more in this open place. So we'll go into like kind of these examples tomorrow, but like CartoDB is like, they just got a $23 million investment in Series B. Like, so I think that their total is like 60 million. Like again, big numbers, big expectations. Mapbox is even more successful in terms of their investment. They just got a $50 million investment. I think that getting their like total investment up to like 70 million. There are, there's clear, betting that's happening, like, in this realm. And then you have more traditional companies. This is a satellite company called Digital Globe that if you've ever seen Google Earth, you'll see like the attribution on the right-hand side. Like this is where all of your kind of imagery comes from. And they, as I was saying before, with like the Esri example, they are including like, open aspects to their work. So this is a kind of a series that they did of New York that I just really love because, I mean, it's so real that it looks fake. It looks like a video game from my perspective. So that's a handful of examples. And again, these are, quote, in the open. So to sum up in my last couple minutes, what I've learned when it comes to doing business in the open, I think there's a little bit of like you have to continue to define the space. Like I was saying, like work from abundance. Like this is something that like really I think continues to be present and as a muscle. That again, not just myself, but like my competitors. You can like also feel like them like exercising this conversation, and that it's also. I guess I feel like this in many aspects, but like that it's also like your business, like what you decide to do, like in this world, like is also like where you end up, like it's the day to day, not like the paycheck, and that when it comes to open, I think the lure of taking compromises when it comes to like the business requirements is very strong, and to find ways or situations where you don't have to take shortcuts. And then finally, sure you guys recognize this with like any sort of critical academic theory, but I think any idea that like open is like the way to go, and business is like perfect is very complicated things. And so I think that in order to like operate in the open and like these open source communities, as well as operate in any sort of business model, there's like a kind of I think an awareness that some things like are really working great and might be more exciting than like working in a traditional company, and other things are really messed up and could be a lot better in a traditional company. And so it's like the balance of the two. And I think also for many of us, like we do work, but we're also like advocates or try to like change it as well. So I think it's harder to hide in these open source communities because there's more about like active involvement and that you matter. And then last slide. So this is our tagline, actually. I think when it's called Start Where You Are. And when I first like joined the company, I was like, I don't really, it sounds really zen, doesn't really make sense. When do we get to change it? But like, I think especially with open, like, and recognizing that like it is not perfect, but like you have to start somewhere. And this is again for the code and for data. Like you start wherever it is, and then it's the the idea of like putting it out in the open, that it continues to get better. And over the course of like five years that like I've been involved more actively in like an open data conversation, it's exceptional, like the strides that like the community has done to make like all these aspects like a lot more better, and for products to be able to rely on them in a more like solid capacity. So 504.
So what are you talking about tomorrow?
So tomorrow I'll kind of go into like more like specific business models, as well as like give examples of like how people are operating in the space. So everything from like, as I was saying before, like a traditional company like, Digital Globe or Esri that like are like excited about open, to the sort of business models of being like 100% open. And for us, where I come from in terms of business approach is like a lot around partnerships. So like, what does partnership look like in this kind of making money space? Most of the examples, I think, if not all of them, continue to be in the mapping world, because this is what I'm most familiar with. And so I think it's a little bit more potentially interactive, but like a little bit more, let's see what you guys are interested in when it comes to like the different ways these open source communities could look.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for staying too.